If you're thinking of working here, don't. This place is a trap. That's not the kind of line you expect to hear when stepping into the most upscale restaurant in town, where the menu is embossed on leather paper wine glasses, are polished before each pour, and every dish is designed like a piece of art. But those were the exact words whispered by Sophie Lane, a young waitress with her hair neatly tied back and a smile that seemed to belong to an older, quieter world as she placed dessert on the table. She wasn't speaking to a friend. She wasn't speaking to the manager. She was speaking to a man she assumed was just another tired business traveler wearing a turtleneck sweater and a cheap watch. What she didn't know was that this man was Daniel Whitmore, reclusive billionaire and founder of the prestigious Whitmore Reserve Steakhouse chain. And that quiet warning shattered the soundproof glass between a CEO and the reality of the company he built. Daniel hadn't come here for dinner. He came because something in the reports had kept him up at night. Revenue was steady. Customer traffic remained consistent. But the employee turnover rate had spiked dramatically, and 3 managers had quit in a row without explanation. He felt something was rotting from the inside, and he knew there was only one way to uncover the truth. No press, no chauffeur, no blazer. Just a man in his 40s, returning to the very brand he had built from nothing, but this time as an outsider. From the outside, the Westbury Heights location still shimmered frosted glass, reflecting soft light, polished ebony wood, fresh flowers in crystal vases. But behind it all was a strange silence, the tension of a place that had lost its soul. An overflowing trash bin, a flickering hallway light, and the wealthiest restaurant owner in the region, walking through a door that felt as heavy as the doubt in his heart. And then the line was spoken, quiet as a breath, but sharp as a blade. This place is a trap. Some stories don't start with gunshots. They begin with a whisper. And in that moment, Daniel knew if he didn't uncover the truth, it wouldn't just be a restaurant that fell apart, it would be his entire faith in people. Daniel Whitmore sat silently in the booth near the fireplace, the very spot where in the early days he had personally tested each cushion and checked how the light reflected off every knife blade. Every detail in this restaurant bore his fingerprints, from the embossed menu to the oak flooring imported from Italy. He had built an empire bearing his name, Whitmore Reserve, not just to serve steak, but to create a memorable experience for anyone who stepped inside. But tonight, as he looked around, he saw no experience. He saw staging. He saw performances. He saw weariness. The hostess greeted guests with a thin smile and hollow eyes. The waiter polished a wine glass 3 times, but never once looked up. And Sophie, the one who had whispered that warning, was still working like she hadn't said a word. She was professional, efficient, but there was something in her eyes that caught in Daniel's throat. It wasn't fear. It was the quiet resignation of someone who once had hope and had learned to let it go. Daniel had once believed that if the system was solid, the people would adjust accordingly. But now, that very system was harming the very best people in it. A customer made a small complaint about the delay of their meal. Sophie bowed her head slightly in apology, then hurried across the dining room as if one slow step would land her in a disciplinary meeting. A young server on the other side nearly stumbled under the weight of a drink tray. No one helped. No one even looked. The manager stood near the kitchen, arms crossed like a warden overseeing inmates. Daniel used to think that if everything looked fine, then it probably was. But tonight, he learned something new. The quieter a place is, the more danger it might be hiding. And in that silence, he realized this story didn't begin with financial reports, customer reviews, or a cold steak. It began with the look in Sophie's eyes as she poured the wine. The look of someone who had lost faith, yet still clung to the hope that someone might finally listen. He didn't know exactly what was happening here, but he knew one thing: I built this restaurant to give people pride in their work, not to make them fear every step they take. As the wine glass touched the table, he looked at Sophie once more, and for the first time in years, Daniel Whitmore was no longer a CEO. He was a father, a witness, and a man about to do something he never thought he would dismantle, the very thing he created. The next morning, Daniel returned to the restaurant earlier than opening hours. He brought nothing with him but a small notebook and a seemingly innocent excuse. I think I left my wallet here. But he hadn't forgotten anything. He just hoped to see Sophie again, the only person here who seemed to have any soul left. She was setting the final cutlery at table 6. When she saw him walk in, her eyes paused, not fearful, not welcoming, just a flicker of surprise, laced with caution. Daniel spoke softly. I'm not here to complain about the dessert, but I haven't forgotten what you said last night. Sophie froze. She glanced around. The dining area was empty. Then she stepped over and placed 2 glasses of water on a table, as if simply serving. But in a brief quiet moment, she sat down, and she began to speak. You know, I used to dream of working here. Back in college, I'd pass by those glass doors every day and promise myself, one day I'll wear that Whitmore Reserve apron. But once I got in, I realized the thing they call class here wasn't meant for people like us. Daniel didn't interrupt. He just listened, and with every word Sophie spoke, it felt like she was cutting straight through the legacy he thought he'd built. We're only allowed to work 28 hours a week, just under the limit to qualify for benefits. But in reality, no one works just 28. All the manager has to say is, stay a little longer, and by the end of the month, that little magically disappears. And the tips, so many deductions. Restaurant maintenance fee, evening shift risk fee. 1 month, I was even docked for a guest complaint from the wrong table. She laughed, but her eyes didn't. I tried asking once. A week later, my friend who worked full-time lunch shifts was suddenly moved to evenings without notice. Then got flagged for low performance. Then, gone. We learned fast here, speaking up means disappearing. Daniel clenched the notebook in his hand. His heart pounded, not from anger, but from shame. He had believed he left behind a legacy of decency, but instead he had built a stage where people learned to perform in silence to survive. Before she stood up, Sophie said softly, "You said you were a tourist, right? If you're really looking for work, don't choose this place. Some doors look beautiful, but behind them is a room with no way out." And this time, Daniel knew for certain that wasn't a warning anymore. It was a cry for help. After leaving the restaurant that day, Daniel didn't drive back to his office. Instead, he headed straight to a small cafe on the corner where the Wi-Fi signal was weak enough that no one would suspect a billionaire was quietly planning to dismantle the very empire he had built. He called Sophia Chen, director of independent auditing, and someone who had worked with him since the early days. He didn't need many words, just one sentence. "Sophia, I need you to come to Westbury Heights, alone. No notice to anyone. I think we've got a virus in the system." 72 hours later, Daniel, under various disguises, showed up at 4 other Whitmore Reserve locations. He sat at the bar, dressed as a mechanic, ordered a salad at the airport branch, pretending to be a connecting traveler, and even posed as an Uber Eats driver picking up an order. And everywhere he saw the same signs: employees are working overtime, yet no change in their paychecks. tips pooled together, then disappearing under a category labeled Internal Maintenance Fund. Late shifts reclassified as training hours unpaid. All of it traced back to one name, Rick Hale, Regional Director, the very man Daniel had promoted after he saved a struggling branch from collapse. Rick knew the system like the back of his hand, and now he was using that knowledge to drain the workforce, manipulate reports, and build a shadow operation called SpectraComp, a secondary payroll company created to launder stolen tips. Daniel didn't want to believe it, but every piece of evidence pointed to the same truth. Rick was stealing right from the kitchen Daniel had once designed with his whole heart. Meanwhile, back at Westbury Heights, Sophie received a message from an unknown number. "Someone is listening. Meet me after your shift behind the emergency exit." Sophie hesitated. She was used to threats to being watched, had even considered quitting, but something about this message felt different. It wasn't a threat. It felt like a promise. At exactly 10 p.m. after the restaurant had closed, Sophie stepped out back. Daniel was already there, no longer just a customer, no longer a stranger. "I can't change anything if I stay in the boardroom," he said. "But if you're willing to tell the whole truth, I won't let you stand alone." For the first time in months, Sophie's eyes didn't carry suspicion. They held the fragile trust of someone who had lost everything and just found a reason to believe again. They had no power. They had no money. They had no personal lawyers, no media team, and certainly no insurance to protect them if everything came crashing down. But they had one thing: the truth. And when Sophie nodded to Daniel that night, a new story began to be rewritten, not by the owner, but by the very people who had once been treated as the background of a glamorous picture. Under the guidance of Daniel and Sophia Chen, Sophie began quietly reaching out to former colleagues, from the night shift head chef, the disabled waitress, to the immigrant janitor. Each person held a memory, a piece of evidence, and for the first time they were asked what really happened. Nathan, the sous chef, still had photos of last month's shift schedule showing a spike in hours worked yet no change in his paycheck. Maria, the bartender, discovered that her tips during her best-performing month were reported as being down nearly 70%. Jalen, a former server, sent Sophie a recording from a meeting with the manager in which Rick Hale threatened, "If you don't like the rules here, there's the door. Hundreds out there would kill for your job." This exploitation wasn't random. Rick Hale had designed the entire scheme. He partnered with SpectraComp to issue substandard pay while making the reports look clean. He created tip deduction categories labeled internal maintenance fees, service risk charges, and quality reserve fund. Each month, he pocketed nearly $120,000 from these lost wages, then kicked back a portion to 2 regional managers under his command. Daniel stared at the spreadsheets and saw his own name in the owner approval column, but the signature was forged. He hadn't known, but others had used his reputation to turn the system into a machine that drained workers dry. Some employees were too afraid to speak. Some were suddenly summoned to HR without warning. And a few vanished from the system entirely. Rick had sensed something was off. Sophie received another message from an unknown number. "Be smart. Keep your mouth shut. You don't know who you're messing with." Daniel urged her to take a few days off, but she refused. "If I stay silent, then the people who trusted me will never speak up again. I'd rather lose my job than lose my integrity." For the first time in years, Daniel was no longer the one teaching others how to lead. He was being reminded by the smallest, most overlooked people that real strength comes from standing up even when you risk losing everything. Monday, 9 a.m., conference room, 23rd floor of Whitmore Tower. Crystal lights sparkled overhead. The coffee machine ground beans with the steady hum of a yoga chant for executives. Rick Hale walked in, as usual, confident, crisp white shirt, a pale smile offered to everyone. He didn't know that today wasn't the regular strategy meeting. It was a courtroom with no jury. Daniel was already seated at the head of the table. No tie, no introductions, no small talk. Just a single file folder placed in front of him. The silence was so sharp, even the sound of a page turning felt like a blade being unsheathed. He looked around the room. Before we begin, I have a few numbers to share. Some have told me the system's working fine. Employee turnover is low. Customer feedback is good, profits are rising. But they forget, numbers aren't people. Daniel opened the folder. Inside was the evidence from 3 months of investigation, bank transfer records, from SpectraComp doctored payroll sheets, edited internal emails, and a recording of a meeting where Rick said, "The fewer employees know, the fewer problems we have." Rick sat up straight. His face went pale for a moment, then quickly composed itself, like a man well-versed in deception. "This is a misunderstanding, Daniel. All of this was approved by." Daniel cut him off. "And what if I told you my signature was forged, that the reports were scrubbed clean by your own team?" The room froze. At the far end of the table, Sophia Chen stood and placed a small USB on the glass surface. "We verified everything. At least 47 employees across 5 branches were exploited through this system, and 17 of them left the company due to psychological trauma." One of the HR directors stood up abruptly. I never heard about any of this." Daniel looked at him, voice steady, because no one dared to speak. They tried, but every door was locked from the inside. "Today, I'm unlocking it." Rick scoffed. "You think a few accusations are enough? There's nothing in there that proves." Daniel leaned forward, eyes locked. "No, I'm not here to accuse. I'm here to terminate." And he did exactly that. In front of the entire executive board, Daniel signed the termination letter, effective immediately. Company accounts frozen. Access cards disabled. Rick's name erased from the system as if he had never existed. Rick walked out of the room in silence, but the eyes that once watched him in fear now followed him with something entirely different, the belief that this time justice was real. 3 days after that fateful meeting, an internal email was sent to the entire Whitmore restaurant system. Effective immediately, regional directors will be temporarily replaced by a special leadership team comprised of employees recognized for their integrity and effectiveness. All policies related to wages, shift assignments, and tip distribution will be publicly reviewed. All feedback will remain confidential. Signed, Daniel Whitmore, founder. No one expected the first name on that leadership team to be Sophie. She was nearly speechless when she received the call from Daniel. The first thing he said wasn't congratulations, but an apology. "I'm sorry for letting you live in a system like that. But I hope today marks a beginning, a place where those once forced into silence can finally speak and be believed." The entire HR department was stunned to see Sophie, a part-time waitress, taking a seat in the policy orientation meeting. But she wasn't there for revenge. She came with a notebook filled with words from every colleague she'd worked with, each one who had shed tears from being treated like they didn't exist. Under the new leadership, Whitmore Reserve was no longer a restaurant chain that looked perfect on the outside but rotted within. It began piloting a new model called Service with Dignity, a system where tips were distributed transparently with real-time tracking. Work hours and allowances were published openly, so no one's time could be quietly erased behind polished spreadsheets. Each month, staff could nominate a most inspiring teammate, and the winner wasn't the top seller, but the one who had the most positive impact on workplace culture. And Sophie, the same woman once threatened with termination for speaking up, now stood before the entire staff team and said the words that brought the room to stillness. "I'm not here to be your boss. I'm here to make sure none of us ever has to be silent again." At a closed press conference, a journalist asked Daniel whether he thought his actions were too risky for a brand that bore his own name. He simply smiled. "A brand isn't a logo. It's how you treat people who have no power. And I want mine to stand on truth, not fear." 6 months later, Whitmore Reserve was undergoing a transformation like never before. Profits dipped slightly in the first quarter, a change that advisors called the inevitable cost of structural reform. But what no one could quantify was the shift in the eyes of the staff. They no longer bowed their heads when customers shouted. They no longer looked at each other with guarded suspicion, afraid of being stabbed in the back. And most importantly, they no longer flinched at the sound of a manager's footsteps. Because now, the very people who were once dismissed had become the architects of a new culture, one built on trust, transparency, and courage. At the 15th anniversary celebration of the restaurant chain, Daniel didn't stand on stage. He sat quietly among the audience listening as Sophie, in a simple suit, was called up to receive the Most Inspiring Leader of the Year award. No flashbulbs, no overpriced champagne, no hollow praise. Just a thunderous round of applause, not because Sophie had saved the system, but because she had walked into the fire when everyone else turned away. And when asked what kept her going through nights of threats, sleeplessness, and being labeled difficult, she simply said, "Because I once wished someone would stand up for me. But no one came, so I made a promise. If I survived, I'd be the first to rise, so those who came after me would never have to bow their heads again." Some people run entire empires, yet have no idea what's happening in the smallest kitchen they own. Some are shut out of every meeting, yet understand injustice more clearly than anyone else. And sometimes it takes an ordinary waitress to teach an entire system what dignity truly means. You've just witnessed a story about truth, courage, and rebirth. If you've ever been forced into silence, remember that even the smallest voice can shake an empire when it comes from a steadfast heart. Leave a comment if you've ever seen yourself in this story. And if you want to continue walking alongside stories that stir the deepest parts of your soul, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Toch's Story, where we tell stories not just to watch, but to feel, to understand, and to transform. Toch Story, where ordinary people do the extraordinary. And you know what? Justice doesn't always come from a courtroom. Sometimes it begins with one person who dares to stand while the entire room keeps their head down.